Hi, I'm Talia Baroncelli, and you're watching theAnalysis-news. I'll shortly be joined by Libyan analyst Anas El-Gomati to speak about the situation in Libya, as well as Libya's role in the conflict in neighboring Sudan. If you enjoy this content, please consider donating to the show by going to theAnalysis.news and hitting the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. You can also get on the mailing list so that you're informed every time a new episode is published, and also go to our YouTube channel, theAnalysis-news. Hit like on all the videos you want to watch and hit subscribe so that you're notified every time a new episode drops. See you in a bit with Anas. Joining me now is Anas El-Gomati. He's the founder and director of the Libyan think tank, the Sadeq Institute. Thank you so much for joining me, Anas.
Thanks, Talia. I appreciate it.
There's so much I want to speak to you about today, but I think we should start off with what happened after the NATO intervention in Libya in 2011, where Muammar Gaddafi was ousted from power, he was killed, and fighting continued afterwards. And there was a UN-led process which tried to establish elections and a functioning government. I think it's safe to say now that that process has unfortunately failed, and that there are two rival governments now, one in the West, one in the East. What's going on right now in Libya?
Well, it's a really complicated story, and it's always good to start where you pick things up from. So after 2011, I think there are now, it's difficult to look back in retrospect and try and condense those 10 years together. But I would say for the first 3 years, things were not as bad as they are now. There was an episode of violence that was fairly limited in comparison to the last two conflicts that Libya has endured. So one in 2011, 2014, and 2019. But I don't know whether or not Libyans would always consider what happened in 2011 to be a civil war. Of course, as you alluded to, NATO's intervention was heavy on that. But I think it also limited a lot of the potential violence that could have occurred, as we saw in Syria. And I think that's one thing that has to be said about the 2011 intervention. In comparison, the 2014 and 2019 intervention contained the very same players and contained more players. And I think that's where the UN's remit and the turning a blind eye to the kind of malign influence of a lot of regional players and world players that have continued to destabilize Libya has kind of been forgotten. But from 2011 till 2014, Libya was fairly stable, and its progress was actually quite positive in comparison to right now. So there were elections in 2012, 80% turnout, very high numbers for Libya's first elections. And there was so much pluralism in that first parliament that Libya elected that it was a hung parliament. There were so many different groups there because 60% of the seats were given to independent candidates, not running on a party list. 40% were given to a party list. And I think in retrospect, some of those things might now look like a mistake. Maybe what Libya needed at the time was strong party affiliation so that a bloc could come to dominate and say, this is the direction that we're going to take after the elections. But many argued at the time that we don't really know what the Libyans want. We don't know who the Libyans are, so let them elect as many Libyans as possible and let them move forward. So in retrospect, the first couple of years were okay. Yes, there were militias that were on the ground at the time, but they were not conducting the kind of violence that we've seen them conduct since 2014 and since 2019. So for the first 3 years, up until Libya's second elections in 2014, the situation was fairly stable on the ground. There was one single government. It was elected by the Libyan people en masse. And I think in that sense, there was much to be celebrated. And I think, Libya's economic outlook, its political outlook, and its stability in the region were good. In 2014, we had a civil war. And it was along the lines of it's down to the rise of this actor who many may know of and many may not know of, but his name is Khalifa Haftar. And I think, your viewers should know who he is. He has the longest standing political career of anybody in the entire Middle East and North Africa. It spans 54 years. He emerged in 1969 with Muammar al-Gaddafi in a coup against King Idris, and then has gone on to at least launch 7 power grabs over a career now that spans, as I said, 54 years. And those power grabs are not just coups, they're defections from the very partners that he launched those coups with. And, if we start looking into today's recent news, the last 24 hours of what has happened in Libya, which we may come onto in a little while, you'll see Khalifa Haftar's fingerprints and his political DNA all over that. But to set the scene, the first 3 years were not so bad. I think abandoning NATO's biggest mistake was most likely abandoning Libya's political future and the role of regional actors and not immunizing Libya from those two things. There were the creation of militias that needed to be integrated into a unified military and a subservient military, which Libya has never experienced, and was the reason why Libyans overwhelmingly overthrew the Gaddafi regime, because they wanted to live in a society and a state that was not controlled by a family or by personal militias, but by a neutral state security service that respects human rights and allows you to have the same level of freedom no matter where you're from or what your surname is or what your tribe is from, or what part of the country you're from. Since 2014, that has been, quite the opposite. Khalifa Haftar emerged and declared himself to be the leader of the self-styled Libyan National Army, or in Arabic, the Libyan Arab Armed Forces. And with that, he launched this coup and a war on terror that has split the country in two, split the country between two rival parliaments. The first parliament that was elected in 2012, a second parliament that was elected in 2014, and then two rival administrations that were unified temporarily after Libya's last war in 2019 that Khalifa Haftar launched, but has since, as you mentioned, kind of slipped back to another partition after we failed to have elections in late 2021. So, it is a bit of Groundhog Day in Libya, because there have been lots of changes in the middle of the last 12 years. But at the same time, for so much change, it's almost like old wine in new bottles. The same actors are still there from 2011, and they're still here in 2023. And despite the unification process, the UN process that was supposed to unify all these different parts and put Humpty Dumpty back together again, you still have two different governments under different acronyms. You still have two rival military formations. You still have two rival parliaments.
I would argue that the NATO intervention is what pushed Humpty Dumpty to fall off the wall, so to speak. I mean, of course, Gaddafi was not liked by his people, or by some of them at least. Maybe some of them supported him, but
Right,
a lot of people would argue that they were uprising against Gaddafi and they didn't want him to be in power anymore. But the NATO intervention was not conducted in a way that would ensure that there would be something left of the country afterwards. In 2011, you had so many people fleeing the country and, refugees trying to escape Libya and to get to Europe. And a lot of people, unfortunately, died in the Mediterranean trying to make those crossings. So, the intervention wasn't benign, and I'm sure the mandate was not conducted or not designed in such a way to ensure that there would be functioning institutions. And we're still seeing that there's a power vacuum, and now you have, as you said, Haftar, who has his own interests, and you have these rival governments. So just bringing it back to right now, you have a government in the West, the GNA, which is supported by the UN, but I think a lot of other European powers, and by Turkey. And then in the East, you have and House, exactly, like the House of Representatives, which has just suspended Fatih Bashara. So what's going on there? Why was he suspended? And what was his vision, at least, of trying to unify Libya, or was he just trying to grab power and resources?
Can I just touch on your point? To actually agree with you, but just on your initial point about NATO, I think the question about the NATO's intervention, lack of planning, the fact that members of NATO have since gone on to undermine Libya's stability tells you a lot about the way that organization functions. But the reality is that why are these states, what we consider to be strong states, or we thought were strong states, why are they so brittle? I mean, that's really the reality. I mean, a lot of these states, the authoritarian states, the myth of the strongman, and it comes into Fatih Bashara's own personal story, because that's really the crux of this story with this parallel administration that was created. They're brittle states. I mean, they look like they're very strong, but the moment that you poke them, they start to disintegrate, because there are no institutions. There is no plan for a day after, and they're designed to be coup-proofed. And I think this is where a lot of these states, whether it be Saddam's Iraq, whether it be Bashar al-Assad's Syria, or whether it be Gaddafi's Libya, or tomorrow even Egypt's Sisi, and as we're looking at the fall of Sudan and its disintegration into a civil war, the rise of Hemeti, these places, they have such personalized, or their institutions are so personalized, and they're so, they're so brittle that once there is any intervention from the outside, or there is an uprising, then they start to fall apart. But let me come to this question about Fathi Bashagha, because it's a really interesting point that you've raised about what is his motivations, and his own personal story is fascinating. I mean, what you have with the story of Fathi Bashagha is an individual who joined the revolution in 2011. He was a former Air Force pilot, and led a revolutionary armed group, a militia, from the city of Misrata, which became famous during the revolution for being a real kingmaker and power broker in Western Libya, and where the capital is, in Tripolitania. And then he's gone on to then join, over several years, the political class. He was elected as a member of parliament in 2014, in that second parliament that we spoke about, the House of Representatives, and then was appointed as the Minister of Interior to the Government of National Accord that was established in 2015 during the UN process to unify this first kind of a division after Libya's first civil war in 2014. And 3 months into the job, or 4 months into the job, Khalifa Haftar attacks the capital. Now, we should remember that the GNA also didn't have a Ministry of Defense. It didn't have a Chief of Staff. It didn't have a Chief of Intelligence. So he was literally the last man standing in terms of Libya's, or Tripoli's, security. And he goes on to defend the capital from Khalifa Haftar's onslaught. And what begins as just a normal war escalates into a nasty, brutal, personal war of words between Khalifa Haftar and Fathi Bashagha. Khalifa Haftar calls the GNA and the units and the forces fighting underneath him that Bashagha was leading, he calls them terrorists, and says, I will never enter into a dialogue with them. On the other hand, Fathi Bashagha calls Haftar a putschist, a coup plotter, a war criminal, someone that he will never meet with. And in fact, on the record, he says, there will be no peace in Libya whilst Haftar enjoys a political role. Now, that was in 2019 and 2020. And then the civil war culminates with a stalemate around the summer of 2020. Within 6 months, there is a UN political process that says, well, there is a rival government here in the east, there's a rival government here in the west. Let's again unify these two separate halves, and they create a political dialogue forum where they bring in members of the status quo, Libya's two rival parliaments, to appoint two figures, one president and one prime minister. Fathi Bashagha enters into that race with the head of the parliament in the east, who is considered to be Khalifa Haftar's staunchest political ally. So people start scratching their head and they start wondering what happened to all this anonymity. Before the end of that year, before the end of 2021, Fathi Bashagha has stood in Benghazi, the eastern city that has become infamous for the events in 2012 over the last 10 years, and is the center of power of Khalifa Haftar's Libyan National Army. And he shares a handshake with the man that he said there would be no political future for in the country and who there would be no peace with. And Khalifa Haftar, the man who said that he emerged in Libya, not for his own personal political gain or financial gain, but to fight the scourge of terrorism, which he has said that he will never enter into a dialogue with, and shakes his hand. So the terrorists are shaking the putschist's hands. It's an unusual place in Libya, but it's a place where, there are friends with benefits, but there are also enemies with benefits. And that's what happened with this creation of the Government of National Stability. These two figures emerge, and they have this kind of narrative that surrounds them. I mean, everyone has called Khalifa Haftar, or many people have called him, the strongman of the East. But Fathi Bashagha, after his role in the 2019 civil war, he becomes labeled the strongman of the West. And what happens is that these two strongmen come together, forge an agreement, but they're not strong enough to take the capital. They try to overthrow this government of national unity that was appointed in 2021 under Abdulhamid Dbeibeh, the current sitting internationally recognized prime minister, and they failed to overthrow him. And what happened, beyond failing just to overthrow him, it actually dispels a lot of the myths around the quote-unquote Arab strongman. They're only as strong as their rhetoric suggests. And in a place like Libya, where there are no angels on either side of these civil wars, I'll be very clear about that, but there are militias that have emerged that fight for greed. And there are certainly militias and armed groups out there that fight for grievance. And there are those that are going to end up supporting the revolution, and there are going to be those that oppose it and support Gaddafi. The question is not who is right and who is wrong. The question is, what are they fighting for, and how do you get them to stop fighting? And so that deal that was cut between the two rival strongmen of the last civil war, the two political poles of the last civil war, it failed. And it failed because these two strongmen assumed that they could buy their way out of a civil war. Civil wars are there. There's a lot of political rhetoric that are there. There's always going to be financial gain, and there are going to be geopolitical and economic interests that are there. In a place like Libya, that has some of the highest levels of gold deposits, highest levels of cash deposits in the world, of course there's going to be greed, but there's also going to be grievances. And trying to meddle and mold both together and mesh both together has been one of the reasons why we're struggling to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. You can't buy out everyone. You can't buy out people that may have supported Gaddafi's regime. They're principled and they believe in what they fought for. And in contrast, you might not be able to buy out those that fought against him and have now fought against Khalifa Haftar and have now fought against Fathi Bashagha. But as you can see, over a decade, one of the things that no one really looks at is we turn away from these places for a decade and we look back and we say, oh yeah, it's Groundhog Day. It's just two governments. It's just two rivals. They'll fix it eventually. You forget that on a dusty Tuesday in a place like Libya, there are war crimes that are taking place on either side, or any of the sides that we've just mentioned that have been there over the last decade. The buildup of those grievances makes those states even more brittle, and it makes it even harder to then address the number of grievances that have been there for the last decade. So when you look at the rise and the fall and demise of a player like Fathi Bashagha, it tells you a couple of things. Strongmen beware, and those that are buying, beware of what you're buying, because to be honest, that is a myth that has now kind of come down crashing on the plate of analysts and diplomats and commentators across the country and further afield. But also that the serious work that needs to go in, as you mentioned, the serious work and planning that needs to take place after the fact of an intervention like what happened in 2011, or two serious civil wars that have erupted in the aftermath. You can't put them to bed through a handshake in Benghazi and assume there's nothing else to see here, everything will be rosy.
Well, yeah, why don't we talk about that planning? Because, you have this unlikely alliance, as you might call it, between Haftar and Bashagha. And are they in control of some of the oil reserves? Mm-hmm. Or is it the UN-led or the UN-supported government in the West in Tripoli that's controlling those reserves? Because the Libyan Coast Guard, for example, receives an incredible amount of money from the EU and especially from Italy to ensure that people on the move, that asylum seekers don't leave Libya and that they don't arrive in Italy. So they've been, or in other parts of the peripheral area of Southern Europe. So they've been systematically pushed back, and this is of course against international standards, against international norms. It's non-refoulement. It's pushing them back to Libya, and the Libyan Coast Guard has been fully complicit in these crimes, and they're receiving money from the EU to basically, do the EU's dirty work and to ensure that people don't leave the country. Mm-hmm. But who do these people represent? Are they from the West, so to speak, and are they also in control of some resources? And then the most important question would be: are the Libyans themselves, like the Libyan population, are they benefiting from any of these resources and oil profits whatsoever, or are they just completely impoverished?
It's a number of questions you asked, and all of them are pertinent and straight to the point. So I'll try and be as quick as I can to go through them. Number one, I think when it comes to the oil reserves and how they're controlled, that is a really unusual game that it reflects the ways in which wars are fought now in the 21st century and how different they were fought in the 20th century. Libya is littered with mercenaries and foreign mercenaries. There are Russia's Wagner group that operate obviously in Libya. There are other sides and factions that have delivered their own mercenaries, and Libya is littered with militias and tribes. If you ask Khalifa Haftar, when he's blockaded that oil, he said it wasn't me that blockaded it, it was the Libyan tribes. But then he'll put out an order through the Libyan National Army to say that nobody can work from the Libyan military in any of those facilities. In late 2021, I believe, in September 2021, after Libya's oil was blockaded at the end of the civil war in 2019, 2020, that oil blockade was lifted through negotiations in Moscow. So there was an element there of that was hinting at foreign control. It was blockaded again after Khalifa Haftar and Fathi Bashagha established their own GNS, the Government of National Stability, the parallel government we spoke about a few moments earlier. And after they blockaded the oil, Khalifa Haftar negotiated with Dbeibeh, the prime minister in Tripoli, and again stabbed in the back his own political ally, Fatih Bashagha, and lifted the blockade through negotiations in the UAE between, as I said, Dbeibeh and Haftar. And so now Dbeibeh and Haftar each control portions of the oil wealth. None of the oil wealth goes to the Libyan people. They're yet to see any of it. I mean, if you look at, basically look at the pictures, across the country, there is nothing that has been built in that country, arguably since the late 70s. I mean, that's one of the things that Libya is desperately in need of. If you go to estimates of Libyan government estimates, Libya needs in the region of $100 billion of investment in its infrastructure alone. And that's telling. But what is telling is that 100 billion is there. It's in the Libyan coffers. They could spend that money if they wanted to. So much of that money goes into the hands and pockets of Libya's unelected and expired political elites. When it comes to the Coast Guard, it's a very different question. And I think it's really important. One of the things that the European Union is certainly guilty of, if you look at the UN panel of expert reports, is that not only are they training and equipping the Libyan Coast Guard in means that are deeply contrary to international humanitarian law, Libya's own law, and Europe's own responsibilities and maritime responsibilities, but more peculiar than that is that many of the individuals that are responsible for the smuggling of humans and human trafficking, they're the ones that are now part of the Libyan Coast Guard. In the west of Libya, you have individuals known as Fard and other people like that. In the town of Zawiya, that is a critical departure point for refugees and migrants fleeing to Europe. By the UN's own admission and its own panel of expert reports, there were individuals that were smugglers that attended training courses under the EU and were received by the EU themselves. They've either taken material support or support in kind from the EU. What is getting worse now is that for the first time in modern history in Libya, departures are exceeding in the east of the country, where there has been a smuggling empire under Khalifa Haftar. 60% of departures today, the 57,000 that landed on the shores of Italy over the last year, have come from Libya, at least 60% from eastern Libya. And so Khalifa Haftar today has moved from being the commander of the Libyan National Army to being the commander of a smuggling network. You would think that would also irk the European Union or member states. He was received by the Meloni administration 2 weeks ago and given red carpet treatment in Rome. So it's one of those places where when you look at the political landscape, you look at the political fingerprints on the crimes that have taken place, Libya is like living in the upside down. Nothing makes sense. The more crimes that you pursue, the more spoiling that you pursue, the more reward you get. And so, it also tells you a number of other things, that the harder you push, the more you can get. And so for every Khalifa Haftar, you have a plastic one sitting behind him thinking, I could be next. And that's damaging. That's why what you were talking about, international norms, they're not just words and abstract terms that people use to describe phenomena in textbooks. They matter on the ground, because if you keep breaking these rules over and over again, then everyone thinks, if he can do it, so can I.
And unfortunately, it is a lot of the Western actors, such as the EU, who they're involved in indirectly or directly with their money perpetrating these crimes against humanity. There was a UN report saying that, the crimes against a lot of the migrants and asylum seekers who are detained in Libya amounts to crimes against humanity, rape, all sorts of, inhumane conditions in which they're detained. And yet, the EU policymakers, as well as the US policymakers, keep talking about this rules-based order, which they stand behind in European values. And they're just complete hypocrites when it comes to, actually trying to implement policy that would foster those values. And another area that we could speak about is how the EU has welcomed so many refugees from Ukraine who have been forced to leave their country. And they should accept these people and treat them with respect and give them asylum. But at the same time, there's been no legal channels for people to leave Libya or other countries in Africa that have been, stricken by conflict and other calamities and crises. And it's just unfortunate to see that, because the EU has been so present in those regions and in contributing to those crises. And yet there's a racist element to it, because when these people want to come to Europe and seek protection, then it's, oh, these people are just economic migrants, or they're not really deserving of any protection.
I couldn't agree more. Honestly, I think the dilemma that I have in my mind, there are two things. The first is that racial discrepancy. It's certainly not lost on an Arab audience, because they started scratching their heads and saying, how come, number one, how come we're not received in that way? But number two, they don't want to be received in the first place. They want to stay at home. There's no refugee on earth that ever wants to leave their home and take a boat and die, and most likely die, and be ignored and forgotten about and described as cockroaches, but by other European heads of state and otherwise. So there's something that is to be said about the fact that the best way and best policy of reducing a refugee crisis is to prevent the violence from taking place in the first place. And that's where you find, unfortunately, the role of regional Arab states, the role of other European states, and the role of the US and Russia in Libya has got its fingerprints all over that. And I think some countries don't care because they're not on the receiving end. I mean, Libya is considered to be NATO's southern flank and Europe's soft underbelly. And so in many ways, the only thing that is of importance for a lot of policymakers today about Libya is just stabilize it, give it to someone to stop those boats from coming in. And so I think that's really where, when you start to interrogate what their policies could have been over the last several years, why don't you stop the malignant influence of regional actors? Why don't you stop your own malignant influence of working with smugglers and calling them coast guards? I mean, there's a lot more, and I know this sounds strange saying this as a political analyst, but, in a philosophical sense, there's a lot of soul searching that needs to be done when it comes to not only the policy making on Libya, but also the rhetoric. Because the rhetoric is deeply dehumanizing when it comes to places like Libya, places like Syria. If they're called a human, that's the best possible outcome. But more often than not, there's either this kind of like wink and a nod or whatever at the idea that they're either terrorists or terrorist sympathizers or parts of criminal networks. And that's it's the most deeply dehumanizing thing to say about those that are fleeing from conflict and fleeing from terror, fleeing from criminal networks and fleeing from violence that they didn't perpetuate.
It reminds me of Josep Borrell, the High Representative of Europe, and he gave a speech, I think this was 8 months ago or so, in which he characterized Europe as a garden which needed to be protected from the jungle. I mean, just that metaphor, it's so colonial. And, as opposed to when he was called out, as opposed to apologizing, he sort of doubled down on it and was saying that, he didn't mean it in a racist way, but that Europe represents these lofty values that need to be protected from, places like Libya, alluding to the warfare that and the deaths that are, just the horrible bloodshed that's going on there. But, he missed out the important part, and that's how Europe has contributed to the perpetuation of these crimes in the region. But I think the Arab regional actors also play a role. The Emiratis, the United Arab Emirates, have played a huge role in, I think initially they did not support Haftar, and now they do support Haftar. And if you look at...
No, they were the first, actually.
They were the first, okay. But they're also involved in a neighboring conflict in Sudan. So in Sudan, there's a war between the army and the paramilitary rapid support forces, which are led by General Hamedi. And Haftar and Hamedi are also kind of buddy-buddy. So how is the conflict in Sudan playing into the conflict in Libya?
So this is fascinating for me, because I think what it tells you about the brittle states. I mean, states where elements like the RSF in Sudan or the LNA in eastern Libya are kind of on the rise, is because of these interdependencies that they've created with their patrons. It used to be the case that you would think of patron and proxy as being big and small, and one giving the orders and the other one following the orders. It's not quite like that anymore. And what happens is that it's much more flat, it's much more heterarchical, and it's based on these interdependencies that, they're hand in hand, that each one requires the other, and it's much more equal, and there's much more equity and dependability on both. So in a nutshell, the rise of individuals like Hameti, and I can go through what I think is just in a nutshell how these things are taking place and what the effect of Libya is. But Hameti's history in Libya is longer than his history, arguably, politically in Sudan. I mean, he came into Sudan's to be involved in Sudan after the events that led to the transition, the second revolution or the uprising in Sudan, and the establishment of the Transitional National Council there, that brought in together the military, the RSF, and civilian bodies from the street protests. But the RSF, its paramilitary history goes back to the days of the Janjaweed in South Sudan, but also its days in Libya. I mean, it has had a longer presence in Libya, arguably, than it's had in Sudan, and it's fought more wars in Libya critically than it has fought in Sudan. It was fighting, Hemeti's forces were fighting in Libya in 2019. They were brought in as mercenaries. So this isn't just some two-bit relationship between two people that have some alliance. Well, you're an authoritarian, I'm an authoritarian. These guys work together. The second element that is really critical and is important is Khalifa Haftar's son, Sadeq Haftar, was pictured in Khartoum 2 weeks before the events that led to the recent civil war. Sadeq Haftar, according to a lot of journalists that had been reporting about this recently, was in Khartoum to give Hemeti a whisper in the ear and give him vital intelligence, tell him, your friends, the military, are moving against you. So he gave him the vital intelligence at the time when he needed it, and then moved to supply weapons, intelligence, and fuel supplies from Libya's southeast border in the town of Kofra over the border of northern Sudan to the RSF. So in so many different factions and so many different facets, Khalifa Haftar has been critical to helping Hemeti stay alert and stay alive, but also to thrive and sustain this latest conflict. So the rise of someone like Hemeti is because you have a rise in these kind of new burgeoning strongmen who have created these interdependencies. You need my fuel from Libya, but I need your money because, as we said, Khalifa Haftar is not part of this internationally recognized government. He doesn't have any money. He gets his money from the Sudanese military that are paying for the fuel that he's smuggling over the border. And on the other hand, he also gives him intelligence when he needs it. And he's also getting forces, the RSF, when it finishes fighting in Sudan, if there's another civil war in Libya, who do you think is going to go and fight it? It's going to be the RSF fighting on behalf of Libya's national army. So it is such an unusual sense of dependability and interdependencies, but these are the kind of new burgeoning alliances in the region that are going to be so difficult to get rid of. And Sudan's own crisis that could have been mitigated, that could have been stopped a long time ago, is most likely now going to spark a migration crisis somehow into southern Europe. And that migration crisis is going to put us right back to square one. Europeans are going to pick up the phone and say, who do we speak to? Let's speak to Haftar. Why? This is the individual that helped spur that war on in Sudan. He's fueled that war. He's also making money out of the migrants that are crossing and the refugees that are crossing the sea. So instead of being the cure, so many of these actors are like the cancer.
Yeah, they have too much power and they're exacerbating the situation on the ground. They're controlling everything on the ground and they're building up their power so that when it's time for the EU to actually step in and to try to find a solution, then they keep going to the people who are, feeding into the bloodshed.
Well, there is ways around it. I think there's no way around political will. There's no way around that. I mean, I think the political will that should have been there a decade ago, right now, this is the acid test. I mean, on so many different frontiers, on so many different geopolitical, strategic lenses that you can adopt when looking at a place like Libya. As I said earlier on, I mean, the reason why the world's attention is faced on Ukraine is that it is this frontier line. It is considered to be NATO's eastern flank. And no matter which way you look at it, that is a critical border between two major superpowers. On the other hand, Libya is NATO's southern flank. It's also the European Union's soft underbelly, the Mediterranean region. So much of Libya's history has been impacted by European colonial powers, but also by foreign states meddling in their affairs. But you could also argue in the same breath how much of European populism, how much of Europe's recent history with Brexit and its own recent history of far-right movements rising up, how much of that has been impacted by Libya? They're kind of like two glasses filling one another at different times. And so these regions are interconnected. What happens in Libya really matters for Europeans, and what happens in Europe really matters for Libyans. But they're going to have to change that political will. And when I look at a situation like today, I can't think of any more urgency than the fact that you have conflicts that are no longer easy conflicts to solve. These interdependencies are not just ways of looking at how friendships matter and why these bonds are so deep. what it means is that a place like Sudan, when you get into the nitty-gritty of conflict mediation and resolution, how do you solve a civil war? You bring the two local players together and you say, figure it out. And what they always have to bring in are the civilian parties that are from the street that had no role in that conflict. They should also be they should have their finger on the pulse. They should be saying this is a measure that is acceptable to the broader community and the broader public and the broader society. You can't do that today when you have these interdependent networks, because what is the difference between what Hemeti is doing and what Haftar is doing and what their patrons in the United Arab Emirates who are shipping in so many more weapons, ammunition, fuel, as we said. Russia's Wagner group that is also playing a massive and critical role in playing the logistics of not only bringing in weapons and training fighters from the RSF, but also helping take out to the tune of around $17 billion a year in illegally exported and mined gold from Sudan and bringing it to the market in the UAE, where there are shell companies waiting there and where there is the second or third, I think, after Hong Kong, second or third biggest global market for gold in the world. So what you see is this really vicious cycle and interdependencies that when it comes to resolving a conflict, do you speak to Hemeti of the RSF? Do you speak to Burhan of the Sudanese military? Or do you have to also bring in Russian mercenaries, Libyan mercenaries, if you want to consider them to be that, UAE patrons, the Egyptians that are supporting the other side? I mean, it just complicates and it crowds the space for conflict mediation. And it's almost like, the old saying of all for one and one for all, because if I, the weakest node in that link or in that chain, as Hemeti say, I don't want to keep fighting anymore, then the UAE or Haftar will turn around and say, well, no more fuel for you in peacetime, no more gold for you on the international markets. So there is so much more leverage, and there's so much, they can't just defect, or they can't just walk away and be ripened. This is really going to make conflict mediation in the coming years, this form of warfare, this alliance building, these kind of new alliances, it's going to make civil war mediation and conflict resolution so much more difficult that we could see long wars on the horizon, or what they call forever wars. You can just start seeing forever wars there, because no one knows who to negotiate with to end these civil wars. And the interdependence is so strong that you can't just get one signature on a paper, you need 3 or 4. And they might end up not being signed locally. They might end up being signed somewhere else. So Europe needs to wake up, because these are the kind of conflicts that they could have managed a long time ago, and they still have leverage in many ways over. But the political will and savviness and nous is sorely lacking in my eyes.
Well, the framing needs to shift from these elite who have the resources and control of the military to the civilians as well. I mean, it seems like there's no representative of the civilian populations or civilian structures within any of these negotiations or lack of negotiations, whether it be in Sudan or in Libya. They're just not part of the political process because they unfortunately don't have any control of the resources of the country. So the outside actors don't even go to them. They just go to the ones who wield power and who have military power.
Well, what's interesting to me is that the last individual that had that kind of appeal in Sudan was Hamdok. He just lost credibility because, again, that lack of power meant that he just was a nice civilian face to a military skeleton behind him in the institutions. But when it comes to, the lack of a role for these civilian forces, I would go back to the phenomena of Libya. And I mentioned this earlier on, and I wanted to say with a caveat that there are no angels, in a place like Libya. When you have a brutal civil war like this, you have crimes being committed across the board. But one has to ask why someone is fighting, so you can understand what it will take for them to put their weapons down. And it comes back to this point that we were talking about with Fethi Bashagha and who he came to represent as this strongman of the West versus the strongmen of the East. In the east of the country, the project has been the revival of Gaddafi's Jamahiriya. And the Jamahiriya was not the Ray-Bans, it wasn't the Green Book, it wasn't the outlandish outfits of Gaddafi. It was his socio-political engineering of a patronage structure that led to Libya's state being very brittle. It was all personalized underneath him. There were certain tribes that held military power. They probably account for around 12% of the population in the east of the country. And there were certain tribes, 88% of the population, that don't consider themselves to be tribal, or if we really delve into what that word means, A tribe is a structure above you. So if there is, a war or an incident revolving around blood, then your tribe gets involved if you have one, and if you don't, then the courts get involved. 88% of the Libyan people don't subscribe to that model. So calling Libya a tribal society is really not accurate in any academic or any meaningful sense. But the reality is that those systems are kind of established around this. What happened in 2011 is the other 88% that never had weapons, they developed the capabilities. As we said earlier on, that there was this problem of controlling the arms supplies and the arms control in Libya, and they were dispersed, and this rise of militia and revolutionary armed group took place. But those individuals, they wouldn't consider themselves to be militias. We can sit and talk about them that way and academically kind of scrutinize their role and put them into nice boxes. But if you ask, one of these militiamen yourself and say, what are you? I'm a civilian that's got a gun, and so that might look like Texas to me. That might be a place where there's that high proliferation of weapons, and each socio-cultural, lens has to be adopted. But in a place like Libya, where you have a lot of people who have weapons, choose to not use them, but choose to use them at moments, these like big political lightning rod moments, like in 2011 when there was a revolution and there was a choice to be with or against. In 2014 when there was a civil war, where Haftar rose up in the east of the country, it was with or against. And in 2019 when he came to the west and attacked the Libyan capital, it was with or against. And you saw that the small number of militias or mercenaries or quote-unquote military forces, they're around 10% of the number of forces that turn up when there's a civil war. So who are the other 90%? They're civilians that have taken up weapons. And so what matters, and the relevance of all of this, is that if you don't include those civilian forces in your political debates, they will take up weapons themselves. And if you don't include them when they're taking up weapons, then you'll never get the militaries and the institutional stability and security that Europe and the West has been craving from Libya. So it goes back to kind of like the basic question, when it comes down to these wars, it's planning. It's also understanding that if you don't do something now, things will always get worse before they get better. I just fear that we're so far away from the right kind of diagnosis of the situation that we're nowhere near the cure. And that's really kind of what keeps me up at night when it comes to a place like Libya.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Anas. It was great speaking to you, and I'm sure there's so much more that we can speak about next time, and hope to have you on again soon.
Pleasure. Thank you.
So thank you for joining me, and thank you for watching theAnalysis.news. If you'd like to contribute to this show, you can go to our website, theAnalysis.news, and hit the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. Also, get on the mailing list so that you're notified every time there's a new episode, and like and subscribe to the YouTube channel, theAnalysis-news. See you next time.